Hello everybody and welcome to this week's video. I've got my co-host for the day, one of my co-hosts. We have Prada here because this week's video is a species spotlight on Chahoua geckos. As always, we'll go through lots of different information on Chahoua geckos, from their location and habitat to diet, behavior, and any fun facts that we find out about them along the way. Just before we get into this, I do have an update for you about the Chahoua geckos at the end of this video. So stay tuned for that. Let's get into it. Starting with location, Chahoua geckos come from New Caledonia. This is the same location that some other species of geckos come from, including crested geckos, gargoyle geckos, and Legionna's geckos. Chahoua geckos is the fourth gecko that also comes from New Caledonia. So a lot of this information is going to be very similar to the video I did on gargoyle geckos, with different variations throughout. That being said, Chahoua geckos come from two main areas in New Caledonia. So we have two different species. There's the mainland Chahoua geckos and the Pine Islands Chahoua geckos. Which Pine Islands tend to be a little bit larger with longer snouts, and mainland geckos end up being a little bit smaller with shorter snouts. These geckos are considered medium-sized geckos, medium to large as far as geckos go. They range from about 8 to 10 inches in length, and that's from head all the way to the tips of their tails. Prada is obviously not a full-grown Chahoua gecko. I do have examples of that coming up though, so keep watching and we'll get to the different geckos throughout the video. They come in a variety of colors, and they tend to have two different color settings, if you will. Again, much like the other New Caledonian geckos, they can be fired up or fired down. They tend to flare up at nighttime or when they're in like heightened sensory situations. So if they're afraid or hunting or they're stressed out or they're mating, their colors tend to be a little bit more vibrant. When they're relaxed and kind of just chilling, they end up being a little bit more muted. So she's actually kind of in the middle right now. She was really like light brownish gray when I got her out. She will end up probably getting a little bit darker as we go through this, depending on her emotional state. They will also turn those vibrant colors at nighttime. So later on tonight, she'll be a totally different color than she is during the day. The lifespan of a Chahoua gecko is between 15 to 20 plus years. So they are a fairly long-lived pet, which is really nice, right? Like, you know, you get certain animals and they're only around for a little bit of time. It's never enough time with them, but at least they last that long. Whereas like our vampire crabs, their expected lifespan is like 2 years. So, you know, if you're spending as much money as you do on one of these, you want them to be around for a long time. Other noteworthy description things is they've got pretty big elliptical eyes, so like cat eyes, and they dilate at nighttime when there's low light while they're hunting so that they can see better in the dark. So they are nocturnal. The other noteworthy thing about their appearance is their toes. So they've got these big funny looking toes. I'll have to get you a close-up of their toes so you can see what I'm talking about. But they have their little toe pads, and then there's claws on top of those. The structures on their toe pads are called setae, which brings us to our first fun fact of the video. These structures on their toes allow them to stick to surfaces like glass or whatever, using something called van der Waals forces. And it's basically, because I'm not a scientist of this type, it's a distant dependent interaction between atoms and molecules, and they use it in molecular physics and chemistry. I don't know all of the specifics of it. If you want to look into it and see what they actually use, it's called the van der Waals forces. And it's basically they're like disrupting on a molecular level different atoms and stuff to stick to things. So very cool. They're better at science and physics than I am. Okay, next we'll talk about habitat, but before that, this is Gucci. So he is about a year old. He will be eventually paired with Prada. We wanted to get something that has really nice greens on it and is a little bit more light in color. And he was just the perfect option. He has really, really pretty parents, so he carries some really good genetics, and he's a little sweetie. So that's part of the surprise, is that we do have a breeding partner, hopefully, for Prada. Once they're old enough to be put together, we have to see if they get along, but I'm pretty hopeful about it. Anyway, habitats. Chahoua geckos come from the humid rainforested areas of New Caledonia, as I mentioned earlier, and they kind of live in the trees, not in the top canopy, but underneath of all of that. So it's pretty wet, humid, and they're constantly climbing around in like vertical spaces, on trees, on vines, whatever is around. The temperatures that they live at, again, very similar to what was mentioned in the gargoyle gecko video, is basically around 72 to 78-ish degrees Fahrenheit, or 22 to 26 degrees Celsius. So they actually survive pretty well at room temperatures. If you're keeping them as pets, they are super great as a first-time pet because they survive at room temperature. You don't need heat for them. You can just kind of have them as long as your house is in that range. Humidity levels for them is between 60 to 80%, but it varies throughout the day. You have to think about, in nature, the humidity is not one stable temperature, so it shouldn't be in captivity either. So with the humidity, there's obviously rainy seasons and then drier seasons. You can kind of mimic this using a misting system if you want to automate it, or just by spraying the enclosure a couple times a day. And again, they do require lots of vertical spaces because they climb and jump around in the trees and vines of the rainforests, hunting, searching for food, all that good stuff. So you want to make sure that if you're keeping them in captivity, their enclosures are taller than they are long. They need that vertical space. As for behavior, it varies. So they're fairly calm. You guys saw with Prada, she kind of just holds still. She doesn't do a whole lot. I will say, when I get her out of her enclosure, sometimes she is very sassy. She tries to like warning nip at me and like makes this little squeak noise. She doesn't do it all the time, only sometimes. I have no problems really getting Gucci out of his enclosure, but he tends to kind of run around more. So behavior varies from Chahoua gecko to Chahoua gecko, but they're usually fairly calm and handleable as far as pets go. Again, this is similar to crested geckos or any other gecko really, any other exotic pet. Some of them have one temperament, some of them have another temperament. But generally, let's see if it jumps. Generally, they're pretty good. You're not gonna do it? No? Okay. They are most active at nighttime. As I mentioned before, they are nocturnal, so you might not really see them a whole lot during the day, or they probably won't be doing a whole lot. But once the lights go off in their enclosures, you can see them running around and climbing things, and I actually have one that watches television with me from her enclosure. She can see the TV through the glass, so she sits at the front of the glass and watches TV. And again, they're not likely to be aggressive unless they're like very frightened or territorial of their enclosures, or they just don't want to be held. Sometimes that happens. It just depends on the individual. The other time that they can be aggressive is if they are a female and they are about to or have recently had eggs or laid eggs. Then they can be kind of protective sometimes. But all in all, they're pretty good pets. This brings us to fun fact number 2, and it's already been mentioned in the Gargoyle Gecko video. Again, like I said, a lot of the stuff is repeats, but Chahoua geckos can drop their tails if they're threatened. Much to the same vein as crested geckos or gargoyle geckos or Leachianus geckos, they can all drop their tails. I've heard mixed reviews on whether they grow them back or not. However, Chahoua geckos are less likely to drop their tails than some of the other geckos because they actually use them quite a bit. They're called prehensile tailed geckos because they actually will hang on to things with their tails. So they are less likely to give them up because they use them to hold things more than some of the other geckos do. So they can drop them, but they won't unless they have to and have no other choice. Good job. Alright. We're gonna move on to diet next, but I have to switch out our co-hosts again. And this is part of the surprise. So, 1 second. It's a stick! No, I'm kidding. So, just before we start the next part, I get to introduce you to Valentino and Maybell. So this little dude is Valentino. He is a breeding male. They are actually an established breeding pair. So some wonderful, wonderful friends of ours were downsizing in order to make room for new projects. And they thought of us when they were thinking of new homes for Valentino and Maybell. That makes me feel super good. I feel honored that they would even consider me for that. So I'm super, super excited. That's part 1 of the surprise. There is another part of it that I'll show you right at the very end. But I now have a breeding pair of Chahoua geckos that have already been laying eggs and they've had successful clutches from. So very exciting. But they are here to be my co-hosts for the last 2 parts of this, which is diet and then breeding. So, let me just show you guys. So Valentino is the male. He's very pretty. He's very dark right now. He gets a little bit more green than this at nighttime. But he's a very sweet boy too. And then we have Miss Maybell. Let's see if she comes with me. So resistant. There she is. This is Maybell. She's gorgeous. She's a very, very sweet girl. She's the mama of Prada. Actually, these are Prada's parents. So Prada will probably look something like them at some point. Or she'll look totally different. We'll have to wait and see. But these are her parents. They have been a breeding pair for a couple of years now, and they will continue to do so, hopefully. So, let's go over breeding first, since I'm talking about the breeding pair, and then we'll talk about diet, and then we'll wrap up and show you the last surprise. So, Chahoua geckos have a breeding season from about March to like September, August, September, depending on where you're located. And the females typically have about 6 to 8 eggs total throughout that time span. They usually have 2 at a time every 60-ish days. So it ends up being 3 to 4 clutches of 2 eggs typically. The eggs themselves are very hard and calcified compared to some of the other gecko eggs. So that can actually make the females susceptible to calcium deficiency. So we'll kind of get into that in the diet as well, but they do actually need calcium supplemented in order to keep them from crashing, essentially. If they get calcium deficiency, they can get kinked tails, it can affect their spine, it can affect their jaws, all sorts of things. So you really want to make sure that if you're going to breed them, that you supplement them with calcium that has vitamin D3 in it, or vitamin D in it. It's very important. They can be kept together as a breeding pair successfully as long as you go through the introduction process. You have to see if they're a good fit for each other. So you're basically playing matchmaker. You don't need to separate them at the end of breeding season if you don't want to. You just have to make sure that you provide good hiding spots and lots of foliage in their enclosures so that she can get away if she wants to. It's also been brought to my attention by the wonderful people that we got them from that matching personalities is also important. Typically the males are a lot more demanding or pushy with what they want. So if the female can't deal with that, she might end up actually getting injured, and it does happen from time to time, so then you have to separate them. However, Maybelle here is not taking crap from anybody. Valentino is a very, very sweet boy, but she would do just fine. She wins in these fights because she is such a tough girl. Mr. Valentino, where are you going? So yeah, matching their personalities can be important as well, just to make sure that your geckos, that are your pets as well, don't get injured. The eggs themselves can take about 60 to 200 days to hatch, depending on the temperatures that you put them at. So lower temperatures end up taking longer, and apparently you get more robust and healthier babies, potentially. Higher temperatures, they'll hatch faster, but you can sometimes run into complications. That's what I've seen it say, at least. I don't know how true that is, but that's something for me to kind of look into and, test on my own. Last thing we have to talk about is their diets. So again, New Caledonian geckos, very easy diet-wise. They live on a diet of fruits, plant nectars, and insects. So, in captivity, they're very easy to take care of. They can survive on a diet of insects and crested gecko diet, or rapashi. It's like a little powder mix that you mix with water, and it makes almost like smoothie consistency, and they will eat that, or drink that with their tongues, and then they like hunting insects. And it varies from gecko to gecko as to which one they prefer or what combination they prefer. So that's something to kind of play around with, but they will eat rapashi and insects and be totally happy. Again, the only other thing to mention is dosing them with calcium with D3. Because they need that calcium in order to not be calcium deficient, we want to make sure that they are healthy. That is one of the things you have to supplement them with. Especially females, if you are going to breed them. They for sure need that calcium in order to make those eggs that are very calcified. And with that, that's basically everything you need to know about Chahoua geckos. So, before we end this video, I will show you the other part of the surprise. I have to put them back though. Alright, so our last surprise before we end the video is eggs. The one I picked up, Valentino and Maybelle, they actually gave me the last clutch of eggs that they had to incubate and hatch on my own. So I have 2 little gecko eggs that are incubating now, and I am terrified and stressed out because I've never done this before. This will be my first time. I wasn't expecting to have any eggs until the coming year with the California king snakes, but again, wonderful people who have given me the chance to do this sooner. So stay tuned obviously for updates about the eggs and how they're doing, and if I get any more, I will obviously let you guys know. But my breeding projects essentially start now instead of later. I'm very excited but very nervous. So we'll see how it goes. With that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. As always, it means a lot to me to have anybody tune in to see what I'm doing. and to listen to my videos. Remember to hit like, subscribe, leave a comment. It helps me know that people are actually watching the channel, and it helps the algorithm know that people want to watch my stuff, so that would be beneficial. Remember, as always, to do your own research, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!